To me, it was a culture shock that people would wear their regular day clothes at home. Personally, whether I roll out of bed in a scrambled state still or come back home and want to be comfortable as quickly as possible, I will wear a dressing gown. It's also a great option for hosting ghosts and to get some chocolate in the middle of the night from a nearby kiosk. Because it's so simple in its essence, you can basically mold it to be anything you want. It is a very quick, simple project. I'll show you how I make mine, all the details I add. If you're new here, this is a series. I'm on a mission of creating a whole wardrobe from scratch, and I'm actually using this dressing gown, which some of you liked, as a reference, which is a super simple T-shaped gown made out of gorgeous fabric. And in a way, this is what it's all about. Here are some of the names I've come across. Dressing gown, morning gown, wrapping gown, tea gown, negligee, halat, hostess gown, déshabillé, smoking jacket, banyan, peignoir, housecoat, morning robe, lounging robe, robe de chambre. Slightly different shapes, slightly different occasions, since the upper classes like to dress up for each hour of the day, but very similar vibes. An 1847 article describes the peignoir, which is a dress to wear while having your hair brushed, obviously, as a release from the mortal coil of clothes. To me, this grey area between privacy and decorum has always been fascinating. We already talked about negligées for the neglected state in a previous video, and a dressing gown, it's in the name, is transitional between the dressed and undressed state. I suppose this need for a release existed since the beginnings of fashion, but the traces of how this garment becomes a fashionable item, well, they are still rather prevalent. And it starts with the well-traveled Dutch boys through the Dutch East India Company. For a while they were the only Europeans allowed to trade with Japan. Through this unique access they encountered some of Japan's marvelous textiles and garments. Pretty soon imported kimonos and kosoda had been adopted by European men as an indoor gown. The supply was pretty limited though, and before long banyans appeared. The word itself can be translated as merchant. In Dutch, those were still called
Japanse rokken,
so Japanese frocks. And those were very luxurious indoor gowns that drew from Indian, Persian, Ottoman, Chinese and Japanese inspirations, often made from imported Chinese silks or Indian cotton chintzes, and in a way all falling under the same umbrella of exoticism. Often this was filtered through European traditions of tailoring, so there is a sartorial fusion of sorts, garments with satin sleeves, decorative buttons or fitted backs. By the way, it can be so frustrating when doing research because they all have varying visual language and clearly inspirations from different cultures, yet they are all called banyan. And I'd really like to focus on the connection to Japanese kimono and kosoda specifically. The emphasis on fabric and drape rather than tailoring. Those elements became deeply woven into the Western imagination of the dressing gown. And what I mean by that more broadly, in Western fashion, during that time anyway, we can see how clothing that is worn out in public, well, the day-to-day garments, those were mostly concerned about tracing the shape of the body, or what is to be considered the shape of the body. The fashionable body, especially if we talk about women. Japanese fashion, and again this is very broadly speaking, is more about veiling the body in fabric. The body in that sense is almost secondary by contrast. Now the traditional kimono and kosoda is constructed from these narrow bolts of fabric that are cut very efficiently so that the selvage is right at the initial seams. I feel like this technique already shows that the fabric is the guiding force here. There is, however, well, obviously, a language in cut and form. If we look at the sleeve length, for example, and in the way it's worn, in styling essentially, a very rich history of symbolism and craftsmanship. So just a bit of arrogance there, considering most of these were highly ceremonious for very special occasions. For Europeans, those symbolic coats were dismissed for the most part, and the relaxed fit, it's still only deemed right for the intimate privacy of your 27s and to receive your closest friends and lovers. However, it was the best way to show off abundance of those richly embroidered silks, painted cottons or patterned damasks because of the sheer volume of the pieces, and to signal your worldliness, of course, supposed access to those faraway cultures. For a while, the idea of a studious man becomes deeply associated with this leisure garment, leisure itself being a signifier of status as well. Conspicuous leisure, as opposed to productive labor, is most likely why any form of a dressing gown was needed at all, why this grey area appears in the first place. And you know, especially since the great masculine renunciation, when fashionable men eventually started to dress like shadowy figures, it was probably a very welcome dash of color and variety in men's wardrobes. And it was still a very rare garment too, so check, the ultimate status symbol. Now once the infamous Black Fleet with Matthew Perry reaches the shores of Japan, well, the infamous Black Fleet basically forces Japan to open its ports in the 1850s. Access becomes easier, and pretty instantly anything à la japonais becomes à la mode. These beautiful gowns become fashionable even outside of the boudoir. We have examples of kimonos being reworked into the fashionable European silhouette, and a bit later there was another Japanese wave. Designers like Poiret, he drew directly on kimono forms for his famous cocoon coats, and many more others employed these forms in their designs as well. There is so much more to be said on this topic. The smoking jacket, a very tailored sort of dressing gown with its shawl collar, has very similar roots, the smoking activity itself being in the same realm of exoticism as it was understood initially. And I'd love to make one at some point. Looking at women's lounging examples, those seem to be quite often in line with the same frilly, lacy visual language of lingerie, or with the same visual language as the current fashion was, but more relaxed. But there were also banyans for women. And of course, women's dressing gowns also drew and draw from the initial examples as well. In conclusion, what I'm making here today is obviously not a kimono. As usual though, I think exploring the history makes what we wear so much more interesting. I hope this might have given you some inspiration for your own dressing gown if you fancy to lounge in something that is a bit less sporty. And like I said, the fabric is the most important ingredient here. So because it is such a simple and versatile cut, you can use basically anything to make it. As usual, I do advise to stay away from synthetic fibers, however. You can use some velveteen for a heavier, cozier fit. If you use some silk satin, you will achieve a very slinky and drapey look. Slap some lace onto it to get the ultimate conspicuous leisure boudoir gown a la Karine Gilson. I have made a tutorial on how I add lace applique to my slip dresses, by the way, but to me this is a garment that is meant to stay in the practical realm still. I wear a dressing gown while doing chores and stuff. In a way, it feeds my delusion by adding a dash of glamour to these mundane tasks, making me enjoy those a bit more, and I would hate to constantly have to fuss about it being too delicate. So I am using this Dupion jacquard silk, still very glamorous but quite durable actually. Dupion is a type of silk that has these natural irregularities and fine lumps. Jacquard is a weaving technique where patterns and motifs are directly woven onto the fabric rather than printed or embroidered. This is a cotton jacquard, by the way. As usual, pre-wash your garment and all the other ingredients if you want to be able to wash your garment once it's finished. If you wash a Dupion, it will lose some of its stiffness and hence some of its shine too, which I personally don't mind because it feels softer that way. And the initial fabric was also not the right color for me. I have no idea about seasons and stuff, but it just really felt off, so I actually dyed, or rather tinted it slightly yellow, and now it feels like me. So that's also always an option. Now I wanted to tell you all about Sonia Delaunay, an artist and designer, and how she was the reason I decided on this fabric initially. This dressing gown was a huge inspiration, but now that it basically matches my skin tone, it reminds me of the sensor blocks, and that kind of silliness makes me genuinely happy. So the pattern pieces are a bunch of almost rectangles basically. There is this collar thingy going all the way around and at the opening, and the shoulders are a bit sloped. As usual, in the description you can find a free PDF with drafting instructions so that you can construct it for your own measurements and your own preferences. I feel brave enough to mark everything directly on the fabric, still managed to mess it up a bit, so there are some random chalk marks here and there. But you can also construct it on paper first and use that as a guide to cut. If your fabric has checks or floral motifs, make sure that your pieces align and match as well on the side seams. And if there is a clear top and bottom, I would position the sleeves like that. I added 1 cm seam allowance everywhere, all around. I have also added 7 cm extra to the hemline on the back and front pieces because I would like to fold them toward the inside. And on your main pieces you would need to mark the sleeve insert points and the waist points, the hemline points, as well as your center back. Because this is such a practical garment for me, I hate it when the sleeves get in the way when I do my skincare or when I do the dishes. So I kept them quite short. You can make your sleeves as one piece like here, but I slashed mine so that I have a sort of cuff part here that I cut on bias just to make this check stuff a bit more interesting, I guess. I would also like to add some decorative piping in between these pieces, so I have to cut narrow strips of silk satin on bias for that, roughly 2.5 centimeters wide. I got a cord for the piping as well that will be covered with this bias tape. Definitely skip all these fiddly steps if you're a beginner, just connect your cuffs to the main sleeve part. Since my fabric is somewhat plain, I feel like I need to add a few details though. And next to the piping, I would also like to add a sort of loop and a button so that I'd have the ability to make my sleeves a bit more narrow. For that loop, I will also use bias tape and I will stitch it right side together. I select a rather short stitch and place my needle to the left and place it so that the fold is at the edge of my machine's foot and keep folding as I go. The reason we cut all of these strips on bias is so that they won't fray and so that they are a bit more moldable, because fabric that is cut on bias is a bit more stretchy. Now I can set a few knots at the top and push my needle through there with the eye of the needle going forward and turn it inside out. By the way, this is how you would make spaghetti straps as well. Those you'd make even more narrow though. I will now go ahead and add the piping to the main sleeve part. If I had some floral pattern, I'd just set it in, but these checks, I think they demand a bit more precision so that it doesn't look too crooked, so I will break up the piping situation in 2 steps. I will first stitch my bias tape in place. I also secure one end of my loop underneath here as well. And I will stitch from the other side to make sure that it really runs along this line. Like that. And now I can set my cord in there. For that I will use a half foot that I also use for zippers, and I just go ahead and stitch the bias tape over the cord. I can now adjust the loops to the right length and secure it here as well. Now the fiddly part is over, and if you skip that you can follow from here. This is my cuff piece, the right side is facing me. I place my main sleeve piece onto it and I can stitch it now along this edge. If you're not adding piping, just with 1 cm seam allowance. If you do though, you'd need to use the half foot still and try and make sure that your stitch really goes into the initial stitch. By the way, it doesn't have to be that fiddly too. You can use some ready-made piping and then it will all just be one step. You can just sandwich it in between your pieces. So now we can actually insert the sleeves. First, the front pieces can be connected to the back piece at the shoulders, right sides together, and 1 cm seam allowance here again. I press these seams open. And now I can place the sleeve here. The middle of the sleeve needs to go onto the shoulder seam and the ends need to meet the markings for the sleeves on the front and back piece. Don't forget to leave the 1 cm seam allowance loose though. Now you can go ahead and stitch it on. I had to baste everything first though because the fabric is quite slippery and I wanted to make sure that the checks on the sleeve and the main pieces match well. Now, since we were talking about kimonos earlier, on kimonos the sleeve is partly detached under the arm, which allows mobility, and it's also breezy in a nice kind of way. In Western fashion, with this type of clothing, we often see a sort of diamond-shaped gusset that gives this sort of upward mobility to the sleeves. And in general, this is why sleeve patterns look kind of weird if they are fitted, because that way they can sort of look flat when the arms are down, but also allow for your arms to move upward. But anyways, because these are very wide sleeves, I personally never noticed any restriction in movement, so this is why these sleeves are really easy and rectangular here. The seam allowance can be pressed toward the sleeve. Now we would be able to connect them with a side seam in one swoosh. But to finish the side seam, I'd need to add my inseam pockets first. So as usual, if that seems a bit daunting, you can skip that part, you can skip the pockets or add patch pockets later and just connect your side seams with the sleeves. These will be easy pockets though. This will be my pouch eventually, 1 cm seam allowance all around. I usually prefer to use some cotton here, but this fabric is durable enough and I wanted to use up as much as I could. So pretty standard, one side goes on the back piece, one side goes onto the front piece. You need to place the pouch pieces onto the markings right sides together and stitch down from marking to marking. Leave the seam allowance loose though, so that there is less tension there later. Now would also be the time to add the loops for your belt. I will use the straps I made earlier, the ones I used for the sleeves as well. They can be placed either on the front or back piece, and I place one end above the waist marking and the other one down. My sash will be roughly 2 squares wide, so I use that for orientation. And I have basted it in place actually just because I was worried it might get lost once I start working on the side seam. And the other one can be used for the other side, of course. You can also make your loops out of your main fabric or use some sort of ribbon instead or just a strong yarn. It's all about the design you have in mind. And now it can be connected along the T-shape around the pouch. And instinctively one would probably just go ahead and do it in one go, but to minimize tension, especially here in this area, I would rather do it in sections. So first I stitched the sleeve area down and I made sure to not catch the seam allowances here. I left them loose. Now I will stitch the side seam down, and again I will leave the seam allowances here be. By the way, I had to baste again everything beforehand so that these checks flow smoothly into each other, so that they are uninterrupted by the side seam. And then I stitched up to the pocket marking and sort of moved the seam allowances out of the way and stitched around the pocket as well. I have pressed the seam allowance toward the front pieces and pressed the pocket so that on the front piece it slightly turns onto the inside of the pouch. And now these are stress points, so I have added narrow zigzag stitches there. Kind of sad I was too lazy to change it to a red thread. It might have been a nice additional detail, but that looks nice as well. Now I will also add a pig stitch along the edge of the pocket to make sure that this fold stays like that essentially. And that's the finished pocket. I will add a lining in a bit so my edges will be perfectly secure and hidden. If you don't want to use a lining though, you can use an overlock machine like they did here, or you can use a zigzag stitch or whatever you prefer to finish your edges. I generally don't know the terminology here, whether this is still considered a collar if it goes all the way down to the hem. Please let me know, but essentially it is made out of 3 pieces. One main collar piece that goes around the neck and then 2 pieces that go down from there for both sides. You can cut it as one whole piece of course, but because it has to be angled here, I cut it in 3 just to save some fabric and make the pattern continuation a bit more consistent. And because I will need a facing for the inside as well, I cut out these strips 2 times. You can however also choose to cut them on fold and you wouldn't need to do that. The collar that will be on the outside, I have also reinforced it by gluing some flieseline onto it, and I will start by connecting these pieces to each other. Right sides together, and I stitch along the edge with 1 cm seam allowance. And now I have both sides for the collar. You can simply connect them to each other if you want to skip the piping part, but I will now do the same thing I did on the sleeves. It's the exact same procedure, just a bit longer. And speaking of longer, I obviously needed a longer bias tape, so I had to connect 2 together. You would do it like that, stitch 2 tapes at an angle, and when you stitch it on, make sure that the seam allowances are pressed apart. And then once the piping is in there, it will be barely noticeable. Now I can secure the inside and the outside onto each other, right sides together. The piping will be sandwiched so that it runs along the edge, and I will use my half foot here again. Same as with the sleeves. Now I can finally stitch it onto the gown itself, and the way I cut it, the back piece, to make sure that the checks perfectly continue at the side seams, well, I had to basically add an extra square at center back, so my back piece is wider than it has to be. This is not a feature of this pattern, but I will now have to take the square away again, so I will have to create a fold here. But other than that, I will treat it the same. So the collar piece that is reinforced, I place it onto the right side of my gown, and these side seams, those can be secured on the marking for the waistline, right where the angled part of the gown starts. At the hem of the gown itself is longer because it will be folded under, so the collar needs to be secured right at the hemline of the gown, not the actual edge of the gown. The middle of the collar can be secured onto the center back. And now you can stitch it from one side to the other. I have basted it beforehand, of course, because I wanted for the checks to match, but now, finally. And this is the first time I was able to see it in its full form, how it folds and looks. I was very pleased with how this alignment turned out, but it also felt to me that it needs more piping between where the collar is connected to the gown. So I opened it up again, added piping to the other edge of the collar and stitched it back onto the gown. And I'm glad I did, so now there is a second line here. Now on the inside you can secure the collar by folding it like that and securing it by basting it or something and stitching from the right side right into the initial seam here and just secure it all the way from hem to hem. With the sleeves, by the way, this would be the same technique. You can fold the cuff and secure it like that and stitch from the right side into the seam, or you can also top stitch it like they did on my reference gown. I will have it a bit easier though, since I want to add a lining. I chose this cotton for that. It feels very soft, not in a silk way, but in a It's basically several layers woven onto each other way. It is obviously easier to clean than silk. It also absorbs better. If you like to slather yourself with body lotion, for example, I think a cotton lining is just sensible here. And the sort of warm touch of it, I think it makes it cozier. Now for the lining, you'd only need the back piece, the front pieces, and the sleeve rectangles minus the cuffs. And the lining will also be shorter at the hem because the main fabric will be folded under, so it will be 7 centimeters shorter. And I have already stitched it together, same steps as the gown. Definitely pre-wash the fabric for your lining as well. I will start by securing the sleeves. My gown is turned inside out and the lining is turned the right way, the way it would sit inside the gown. I will now place them next to each other and secure the bottom stitch of the sleeve and of the cuff together so that the right sides are secured together. And I will also find the top of the sleeve and the cuff and secure them together as well. And now I will just add some more needles all around to the other side as well. And we would need to get it like that under the machine. The trick is basically to stitch it up to the top and then turn your whole garment around and continue stitching. Aligning it can also be a great way to make the garment reversible if you're into that kind of stuff. Then the collar and the cuffs can be made out of the respective fabric on each side or made out of a fabric that matches both the lining and the main fabric. I will now press the seam allowance toward the cuff, and then you can do the same for the other sleeve as well. Just make sure that you don't twist your lining or your gown accidentally. That happened to me once. Just go ahead and double check that it lies the way it should. But now the lining can be secured onto the collar. First I mark where the shoulder seams meet the collar on the other side. And now I can secure these points onto the shoulder seams for the lining. Right sides together again. And now because I have this fold situation, I also need to create a fold on the lining as well. Again, this is not a feature of the pattern, this is just how I had to cut it so that my checks make sense on the back piece. So now the back piece is secured, I will now stitch it onto the collar. And I think the fold also turned out rather nice. Now I can connect the front piece of the lining onto the collar. And here the waist point where it angles needs to meet the seam where the collar pieces connect. And at the hem here, because the main fabric will be folded up, the lining is cut shorter. For me it's 7 centimeters, 2 squares. So I secure my lining 2 squares higher than the actual edge. But my 1 centimeter seam allowance will stick out here. So I will now go ahead and stitch this side first. Because the sleeves are already stitched, it needs to be done in 2 steps. And then I secured to the other front piece, the other side as well. Here, this is what it looks like at the hem, because we will need to fold it up like that. Letting this 1 centimeter seam allowance loose will make it easier to connect the edge of the lining to the edge of the main fabric. And I start by making sure that the side seams and center back meet, and I just add a few needles to secure it. So I will stitch it together here for about 10 centimeters. Leave this open. We'll need to leave a pocket here to be able to turn the garment to the right side. Then start again at the back piece and stitch until the other side of the collar. I have stitched on my main fabric to make sure that the edge follows the line of the checks, and now we can turn it over. This I'll secure by hand in a bit, but the inside already looks very neat. The thing is though that the collar is not secured in place like that. It's a bit flimsy. So there are a few ways to proceed here. Obviously you can just leave it be. You can also secure it in place with needles or by basting it and then stitching from the right side right into the seam here. And same goes for the cuffs of the sleeve, those you can also baste and then stitch in place. I will do this with a few hand stitches. I need this kind of monotonous work for my sanity. And I would also like to tell you about the Diderot effect. Diderot was a French philosopher, and in 1769 he wrote an essay, Regrets for My Old Dressing Gown. And he describes how he gets a new, fancy, scarlet dressing gown as a gift and basically spirals into consumption because he feels like all of his other possessions are not elegant enough in comparison and don't live up to the beauty and style of his new robe. So he gets a new fancy desk, a new fashionable chair, and in a lot of debt eventually. And that's the Diderot effect. And it's not only tied to clothes, it's about consumption broadly. A warning to those who have more taste than fortune, he writes. What are your thoughts on this? But this is a fun philosophical snippet for the whole dressing gown context. And can we talk about this dressing gown for a second? I can only assume that's the one he wrote about, but these colors together, I think it's gorgeous. So again, I'm not quite sure whether this is a belt or a sash. In German the distinction is a bit different, I think. But anyway, you can make your belt out of a ribbon or one of these cord thingies. I think those look great. I cut 2 strips out of my main fabric so that it's long enough, made sure that these checks continue here, and I also added 5 squares extra on each side because I'd like to make a fringe here. Kind of a new territory for me, but we'll see. And I think if you want to make a fringe, you would actually cut it so that the warp thread would be the fringe. I was more interested in the weft thread though, not quite sure here. Also didn't have enough fabric to cut it the other way, but we'll get to that. I will start by folding my sash, right sides together, and I'll stitch from one edge to the other with 1 cm seam allowance, leaving these 5 squares loose on both sides. Now I can turn it inside out. You can of course secure your edges by turning them inside and top stitch it like they did here. I figured if my plan doesn't work, I could also do that later. Before I proceed, I think I will add a zigzag stitch here just to be a bit safe. I think it was necessary in the end and I took it out later though. Now I will just start to pull out the warp threads. This is probably not the most practical idea I've had, because a fringe like that can get all tangled and stuff. But then again, I figured the sash itself won't need a wash that often, and I could do that by hand, and otherwise it can just patiently wait while the gown itself is being washed. And I think it's such a beautiful detail. Once the fringe was free, I started to divide it into strands and knotted those so that they would sit at the edge here. I feel like you could go even further than that if you're skilled in macrame or something. Like I said, for me that's a new territory, but I'm very happy with the result. A few last hand stitches. This is the time to hide something inside the lining. As usual, these don't need to be hand stitches. You can also just top stitch these edges on your machine. It looks very neat as well. I feel like I have more control that way though, but I know that some people feel like it's tedious. Anyway, the lining, I secure it with a slip stitch, I believe it's called. I pick up a few threads on the lining, then a few threads on the silk fabric, hide the thread in between for a few millimeters and repeat. I add a knot at the end and hide the end of my thread inside the lining. And this is also quite secure and inconspicuous. Now we can deal with this edge here. I fold the seam allowance toward the inside. Again, this can be top stitched, but I use the same slip stitch here as well. By the way, a thing I learned, traditional kimonos are obviously sewn by hand, and you would also not launder your kimono. I mean, this whole idea of washing a garment after each wear basically comes with the invention of washing machines and is also tied to the boom of synthetic fibers. Synthetic fibers are really bad at absorbing sweat and stuff and just start to reek after a while, whereas a silk garment, for example, can be just hanged outside for a while and it feels fresh again. So you just wouldn't need to wash it in the same way. It's more about spot or stain treatment, if anything. However, with a kimono, if you would need to wash it, it would be completely taken apart. As I mentioned before, it is basically made out of these rectangular pieces, very straightforward seams, and you would wash these fabric pieces and then sew it back together again. Now this edge can also be stitched together. I fold the seam allowances inside the piping parts too, and just because I think this edge needs to be a bit more secure, I will add a knot each step of the way. For my dressing gown, but I mean it's a house garment and I don't draw in mud that often, so I don't think I would have to wash it a lot. If I would, I'd probably do that in the machine though, because I'm lazy, but I would use a gentle setting, and it's actually the tumbling that does most of the damage, so I always set my tumbling to the lowest setting, and I let my stuff air dry on the balcony usually. Now one last thing, the buttons for the sleeves, they are covered in the same silk as the piping. I found a position I liked for a button while wearing the gown, a comfortable position to be able to cinch my sleeves. I think it will be more comfortable for certain situations. Wide sleeves can get in the way while sewing, for example, and I'm actually glad I added this detail. I have also secured a button next to the loop so that it doesn't stick out weirdly when the sleeves are in an open position. But anyway, it is finished. This video took so long, partly because I was trying out different patterns, but in the end, simplicity often is the most practical, really. And I think it's suitable even outside of the house. I think it's very versatile in terms of styling. Because it's loose and breezy, I can also see myself wear that out in summer to protect the shoulders from UV rays and stuff. Thank you so much for all the support. It is very much appreciated. Thank you for your patience too. I hope this inspires you to make a wrapping gown like that for yourself. You can make it as easy or as complicated as you want. And on Patreon you have voted for me to make a nightgown, a sleeping gown next. Bye!